Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that. But let's get to this episode. When a colleague pressed German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg about what had caused World War I, Hollweg replied, and it's a quote, if we only knew. This is how Graham Allison begins his Destined for War. This is also a good point from where to begin today's discussion about the just concluded NATO Summit in Lithuania. It was an enlargement summit. The inclusion of Finland and Sweden is very significant because it not only encircles Russia from the north and northwest, but also turns the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. The only littoral of Baltic Sea which is outside NATO and against whom the alliance has added 2 new members is Russia. No prizes for guessing that, of course. Adding to the complexity is the fact that Russia's Baltic fleet is headquartered in Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave surrounded by Lithuania, Poland, and the Baltic Sea. Access to Atlantic and any required operational link-up with Russia's northern fleet could be blocked by Sweden in cooperation with other NATO states. If that's not a threat Russia is taking seriously, we would be kidding ourselves. Finland could play the same role with regard to Russia's northern fleet headquartered in Severomorsk. Then there's the issue of Ukraine's inclusion in NATO. The communique stated, the alliance will support Ukraine on its path towards future membership. We will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. Many policy experts in the US, and I was looking at the analyses coming out after the communique, and I actually used the terms that have been used: uninspiring, ambiguous, head-scratching, and disappointing. So this is the way they're describing the language about Ukraine's NATO membership. President Zelensky called it absurd, responding to a pre-summit statement by US President Biden. Now, it's somewhat surprising that many experts should want to fast-pace Ukraine's inclusion, even as the war is going on. Technically, given Article 5 of the NATO Charter, inclusion would require collective defense for Ukraine and pit NATO directly against Russia. The dangers of that approach should be obvious. Within Europe, while Russia's aggression has been condemned, there are marked differences in approaches between the UK, France, Poland, for instance. Germany has a more complex approach, Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria. Poland, Slovakia in September 2022 actually saw the majority, and this is leaving out Bratislava, supporting a win for Russia. Slovakia, even more than Germany, was near 100% reliant for its energy needs on Russia. Czechia, currently headed by a pro-NATO, pro-EU government of Petr Fiala, has seen first movement, which is a combination of several parties from the far right to the left, protest rising energy prices, chanting pro-Russia and anti-EU slogans. Now, this is ironic, of course, because Václav Havel, the last president of Czechoslovakia, was one of the most ardent supporters of NATO expansion. In fact, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria stand out as outliers when it comes to Russia. Turkey and Greece are more concerned about each other and their neighborhood than Russia. Turkey also has a complex relationship with Moscow, just like I would say it has a complex relationship with the US. Last year, 3 days after the Russian invasion, Germany's Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, made a speech and talked of Zeitenwende. Now, Zeitenwende since then has become a term which is kind of, being thrown around both sides of the Atlantic. And according to the German Council on Foreign Relations, while the government's official translation for that term is watershed, the original German is a bit more nuanced, signifying a turn of the times and an historical geopolitical shift. Now, Germany is particularly affected by sanctions against Russia and increasing sanctions-related problems with China. As the biggest economy in Europe, it is facing external shocks, and as a democracy, it also has internal political debates that are often at cross purposes in terms of what course Germany should adopt. The complexity runs the entire gamut from realpolitik to machtpolitik to ostpolitik. Somewhat ironically, after having given Germany a certain role and direction post World War II, the US and other Western European countries want Germany to do a sudden about face, talking about their frustrations and using another German term, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Geschwindigkeit, or the speed with which Germany should act. Meanwhile, the efforts to bludgeon the Russian economy and to isolate Russia haven't worked to the extent the US-led coalition would have wanted. Add to the mix growing Sino-US rivalry, and the world seems to be sleepwalking into major interstate crises. So let me bring in my guest at this point. I'm joined by Marc Saxer, who is an analyst and managing director at Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Office for Regional Cooperation in Asia, and Christopher Preble, who is a senior fellow and director of the Reimagining US Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. Thank you to both my guests, and sorry for a longish introduction. It's kind of an editorial line also. But let me begin with Christopher. Christopher, are we actually asleep? I mean, I know that there's a big debate about whether we're getting into a new Cold War. There's a big debate about whether sanctions are biting Russia. There's a big debate about who is facing an existential threat, whether it's the NATO-led European countries that are but Russia, whether it's Russia, the bear that thinks it's being encircled. So all of that is there. But give me your sense of what the takeaway is from this summit that has just concluded.
Well, I'll say that my takeaway is somewhat different from those that you cited in your lead-in. But I'll say that, for those here in the United States, and I think mostly in Washington, D.C., where I am, who are disappointed or puzzled by the United States' unwillingness to endorse some European countries, mostly Eastern European countries, request for Ukraine to be granted fast-track membership into NATO, and the Biden administration's reluctance. I encounter very few people outside of Washington, D.C. who are enthusiastic about admitting another country into NATO, and one which, as you point out under Article 5, would compel the United States to be in a more even greater state of war with Russia than we already arguably are, because of the arms we're providing to Ukraine. So I think it's a great credit to President Biden, frankly, that he has navigated this difficult terrain. The sympathies of the American people and, frankly, much of the world is, and certainly the Western world, is with Ukraine for understandable reasons. They've been a victim of horrible aggression, but that does not mean that U.S. And some European countries' strategic interests are identical to Ukraine, which I think is one of the requirements when you make a commitment to a country like NATO membership does, that you are treating an attack on them as you would treat an attack on your own country.
Right. But Christopher, before I go to Marc, I want to sort of go back to the early 90s. There was a lot of enthusiasm in Europe. I just talked about the late Václav Havel. He was an ardent supporter of NATO expansion. There was also a big debate within the United States. And initially, I remember there wasn't much enthusiasm about expanding NATO. But of course, there were voices that were pushing for it. And I remember when I was at Brookings back in 2002, 2003, and when Strobe was the president of Brookings, I actually had a chat with him because I knew that he was one of the supporters of that expansion.
Yes.
But there were also, as you know very well, very weighty voices against the expansion, including the current director of CIA, who's been the ambassador to Russia, George Kennan, various other. There was a letter that was written to. So hindsight, and it's always 2020.
Sure.
How would you look at, or what kind of causality do you think you would see in relation to Russia's sense of vulnerability and NATO expansion?
Well, let me just say this: that first and foremost, this was an act of aggression by Russia. So I do not buy into the argument that NATO expansion compelled Vladimir Putin to invade Russia, invade Ukraine. This was his decision, and it seems almost exclusively his decision. So I want to state that up front. However, with respect to NATO expansion, going back to the 1990s, I think the assumption was, and frankly, you mentioned Strobe Talbot, who some of his subsequent writings have come public. The attitude within the Clinton administration, especially among those who were advocates of NATO expansion, was that Russia was simply too weak to do anything about it. They might not like it, but they simply couldn't stop it. They were just too weak. They were too. This was a truly catastrophic period in Russian history, in the post-Soviet period, as they were recovering from that, the collapse and sort of putting together a new state. And so they were in no position to resist. But I think the reaction of Vladimir Putin's Russia after the 2008 Bucharest summit, where President Bush, against the advice of several leading NATO states, suggested that Georgia and Ukraine should have a pathway to NATO membership, the response within a matter of months was a Russian invasion of parts of Georgia, and then, of course, the annexation of Crimea, the gray zone conflict in eastern Ukraine since then, and then, of course, the invasion in 2022. Now, I think Russia's experience in the war has demonstrated that they are far weaker than they thought they were.
So let me interject here. Based on what you just said, shouldn't there have been a sense that there is a certain kind of causality here?
That's not how most American senior foreign policy officials look at those things.
Okay, we'll come back to this because there's a lot more to discuss about this. But let me pull in Marc Saxer here. Marc, I talked about Germany, the biggest economy in Europe, in so many ways, a very complex relationship with Russia. I talked about the external shocks. I also talked about the internal debates that are happening, and where at the multiple points of view. There's a relatively hawkish point of view, which was adopted by the Greens in the current coalition. There's also this point of view about collective security. I talked about Ostpolitik, going back to the time when Willy Brandt actually, when the foreign minister and then became the chancellor, and so Germany has had to face a very complex situation. Into that has come in this idea of the watershed, Chancellor Scholz's statement. So give me your sense of what Germany is doing or thinks has to do, and whether the frustrations, as I mentioned, by its partners in Europe and across the Atlantic in the US, the frustrations that they talk about, are they justified in voicing those, or do you think that Germany has been able to do whatever it could given the complexity?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Ejaz. And I think you know more about German politics than me, obviously, giving your insights into coalition politics here. Maybe let me start about this, why it's called Zeitenwende, which is a turning of time in Germany, an epoch. Basically, we all know that Germany had a very troubled history, 2 world wars, and was a frontline state. The 2 German states were frontline states in the Cold War. So everything that happened after the end of the Cold War was the golden time for Germans. And we have been looking back at 30 years where it was very comfortable. We always said we are surrounded by friends. We're protected by the United States. There was not much to worry about. Of course, those in the know knew that the world around us is changing, but Germany's wanted to stay on what we call this blissful island for a little bit longer. I think that's the mood that lasted until, let's say, late in 2021. And then this is what was shattered on February 24, 2022. There is actually several dimensions to this, several dimensions of where in a matter of days and weeks, taboos and paradigms shifted faster than anything I've seen in my career. First of all, this is the collapse of the post-Cold War security order of Europe, the Charter of Paris. So the idea that borders cannot be shifted by violence is out of the window. We have war back in Europe, something that was more or less unthinkable. Great power war, at least. Of course, we had Yugoslavia, but that's a different level. So that's the first thing. Germany is waking up in an entirely different security environment in Europe with, I mean, it's only 1.5 hour flight to Ukraine. So it's directly at our doorstep, number one. Number two, obviously, Germany hasn't been doing a lot of the reforms that were overdue. You talked already about energy policy. I think there was a very dangerous, in hindsight, but those in the know knew, energy dependency on Russia. Also, there was I think almost criminal neglect of the German armed forces, who are not in a good shape, and it will take a while to completely rebuild them from scratch. And at the same time, the world is changing. So this is not only about Ukraine and Russia, this is also about the world order and China. So all of these things are happening at the same time. So Germany, in a matter of a very, very, very short time, 1 year, had to wean itself off its energy dependency from 60% to 0% when it comes to Russian fossils, and is looking at the challenge to also isolate itself against dependencies on the Chinese market at the same time. And that is a challenge to the German economic model, but also social and political model that at least my generation has not seen yet.
Right. So let's go back to Zeitenwende. One of the things that Chancellor Scholz talked about was Bundeswehr. And the fact that if we want to have that kind of protection, then we need to have a military that is actually geared to do things that's supposed to do. And then, of course, the 100 billion euro fund. But there is a sense that this speech, which I said came 3 days, I mean, it was 27th Feb, 3 days after the invasion, there was a sense of, emergency, if you will, because at that point, frankly, no one was really betting on the Ukrainian resolve in the way that it expressed itself ultimately. And Putin's own calculation, because the advance that came from Belarus was actually at that time the main war effort, and the idea was to capture Kyiv, install a puppet government, and then negotiate with the West. That didn't come to pass. So Chancellor Scholz's speech has to be seen in the context of those first 2 or 3 days of the invasion, when everyone was really scared of what was likely to happen. But thereafter, there does not seem to have been any, what's the word I'm looking for, some kind of mechanism in and through which, for instance, the utilization of this 100 billion euro fund will happen. What exactly will happen with the Bundeswehr? How exactly is Zeitenwende? Is it a process? Is it just an expression that the world is changing, or is there a broader agenda which has to be undertaken by Germany singly and in tandem with its allies to realize the potential?
Well, you basically were asking before about Geschwindigkeit, or the speed of all, how this could happen, and if this is more of a process. I would say it's a struggle. We're looking at several paradigm shifts at the same time. And if you shift the paradigm in a model, there is going to be an enormous struggle between many, many interest groups. And that's what's happening as we speak. Basically, you have to do short-term things, and then you have to do long-term things. Short-term, you have to repair the German army. and you have to turn it from an out of area humanitarian intervention kind of force into a territorial defense kind of force similar to the Cold War. You're going to have forward positioning of the German armed forces in Eastern Europe, something that was not really done in the post-Cold War period. So there is the military posture, and there is the military capabilities that have to be built up, while at the same time we're delivering weapons to Ukraine from the stockpiles of the Bundeswehr. That's a challenge. So that means you have to rebuild the armament industry, the weapon industry at the same time, which did not have the capabilities that we talk about. In the long term, and this is certainly something that would be worthwhile discussing with my American friend here, we're talking about the overall division of labor within the transatlantic security community, the transatlantic alliance. And what I understand, what our American friends are telling us is, look, guys, the post-World War II or post-Cold War period, free ride, that's over. We have some business in the Pacific. So there's two choices that you have. Number one, you come with us to the Pacific, or we hand over the responsibility for Europe and that what we call the Ring of Fire, which goes all the way from the Baltics to Ukraine, the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, Libya, Sahel zone, all of that stuff which is below Article 5 warfare. Let's say the day-to-day crisis. That, dear Paris, that, dear Germany, that is for you now to manage. So if that's true, and I would be very interested to know if that's also the reading in Washington, D.C., but that's how we understand it. Let me translate that to you, what that means in the political economy. We're going back, right now we're struggling to basically increase the German defense spending from 1.5 to 2% GDP. If we're going back to Cold War territorial defense posture with all that responsibility that I just outlined, we are talking 4% GDP. On top of that is the energy transition. And on top of that is all the homework that wasn't done from a looming euro crisis, banking crisis, and all the other stuff that's in the making. So think about the political economy, how you shift 3 to 4% GDP. That is a massive distribution conflict with massive interest. The German industry has massive interest in this, the German population, the welfare state, all of this is in the making. So I'm not begging for time here. I think I need to ask for your understanding what that actually means, what Enlightenment is all about.
All right, good. So you did a good job, because I don't have to ask Christopher anything now. You've already thrown some questions towards him. I'll just, yeah, right. I'll just add, in fact, corroborating what Marc is saying, that recently at the summit, the suggestion that there should be a liaison office in Tokyo was shot down by Emmanuel Macron, saying that, this is not needed.
Yes.
And so therefore, he has very clearly indicated that we do not want to give China the impression that we are trying to sort of bring NATO into the Chinese zone. And I think that's a smart move. But Christopher, over to you. I mean, Marc has asked certain questions, so I want you to respond to them.
Right. Well, let me respond to that first point. I was genuinely encouraged by the decision not to establish a NATO liaison office in Tokyo, not because I don't believe in the importance of Japan to the Indo-Pacific and to Indo-Pacific security, but because it was, I think, unreasonable for American foreign policy officials and elites to ever believe that European NATO Europe countries were going to play a major role in the Indo-Pacific. It was unreasonable to think that prior to February 24th, 2022. It is particularly unreasonable to think that after February 24th, 2022. So I think on that question, I think we've reached a certain critical moment, a turning point, if you will, in a good way. So with respect to European strategic autonomy and the ability of European countries, as has been laid out, this is going to be a challenge. And I think first and foremost, it is unreasonable for Americans who, while some Americans talking about the importance of burden sharing, also secretly or quietly were perfectly fine to have European countries dependent upon NATO and dependent upon the United States for their security. Remember, one of the original earliest articulations of the rationale for NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, right? So it is unreasonable to think that this is going to be something you're going to turn on a dime, right? On the other hand, the talk around burden shifting, not just burden sharing, but more equitable burden sharing and eventually burden shifting, has been ramping up for some time. And I think it's especially urgent in light of what's happened over the last 16 months that this process begin. Now, to the point about the burden that would fall on Germany, the largest economy in Europe and the fourth largest in the world, it is also true that the collective security efforts of the NATO countries could be made more efficient with better coordination and better alignment around roles and missions. So it is not a burden that falls just on one country, not even exclusively on Germany, even though it is the largest economy in the continent. But this will take an effort. I don't dispute that for a minute. And yes, some hard choices are going to have to be made.
Okay. So, Christopher, a follow-up question, which I want Marc also to respond to. So, given Zeitenwende, assuming that Germany begins to develop its military prowess, as Marc mentioned, given the political economy of it, it's going to, in many ways, transform Germany. It will not be a Germany that Europe and the United States is dealing with just now. It will be a more confident Germany that burden sharing or burden shifting is going to, in many ways, change the nature of Germany. Post World War II, the kind of direction that was given to Germany and the manner in which Germany had been vanquished over that period, all these values have been internalized by the German society, political parties, governments, subsequent governments, and so on and so forth. So, do you think that there's a sense of wariness in the possibility of a Germany that is now no more wary of being sort of militaristic, militarily strong? Or are we talking about an era now, or a period, if you will, where a throwback to the old sort of, Prussian sort of, approach to military power is unlikely to happen?
I think that's unlikely. I'd love to hear from Marc, but I think that's unlikely. I think that the Germany's contributions during the Cold War, West Germany's contributions were substantial. The Bundeswehr was a serious military force and had a major role to play in defending Germany in the event of a Soviet invasion from the east. The Russian military, as we've talked about, is not nearly as capable as the Soviet military. And collectively, I think the countries in Europe are growing to appreciate the value that greater German military capability would bring to the table, and are less concerned.
Basically, the premise that Germany is going to be more confident in the future, I can only answer right now, there is not much confidence in Berlin. There's just an opinion poll that came out, I think, this week, and it showed that in terms of the percentage of people who are afraid of the future, it's the highest percentage ever polled, ever in post-war history. So Germans right now are disoriented and very, very wary of the future. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the war. But it's not only the war. There's climate change, there's migration, there's all sorts of things. But go back to your point. So let's say Germany rebuilds its military, and it's always going to be an alliance military. There's not going to be a German singular force. I think that's for sure. But you need a strong economy in order to sustain that. I mean, I've been talking about certain GDP numbers before. You call Germany the strongest economy in Europe. But in what shape is this economy really? I mean, Germany has not been innovative and has somewhat lost touch with the technological frontier. When we talk about semiconductors or AI or things like that, Germany is not even in the leading field anymore. Now we've been cut our source of cheap energy, and we're seeing dark clouds on the horizon when it comes to the export-led part of this economic model, right? So at the same time, you have a much higher burden. You will have to take and bail out probably several parts of Europe again when the crisis hits. I mean, that has a lot to do with the interest hikes that are coming right now. So we're going to see a lot of states and also a lot of companies in dire straits in the near future, also here in Asia, by the way. And that means that Germany will have to fight several fires on several fronts, and it's not in a really good shape to do so. So I think that part of the Zeitenwende is also something that we have to make sure that we keep our industrial base intact and actually make it dynamic and innovative enough to be able to meet the challenges of the near future. It's not the far future, it's the near future.
Well, every single point that's been raised by Christopher and Marc, one can have a program on that. So obviously we can't cover everything. But here's the thing, just to sort of, not really ground ourselves into our nationalities, but looking at the broader picture that's emerging. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, where the writer was talking about, the old sort of science three-body problem, and focusing on the nuclear thing, which was that, it's now the United States, Russian Federation, and China as the three states with major nuclear arsenals. I kind of chuckled reading that, because to me, if I were to present it like a three-body problem, which, as we know, vexed Newton so much, I would say the current interstate rivalries, like there is this thing with Russia, but the actual peer competition is with China. In many ways, it's, you can find similarities with Cold War. In many ways, it's very different, because this is not the Soviet Union economy. This is an economy which is constantly innovating. And in purchasing power terms, the economists say it's already bigger than the US economy. So those rivalries. Then the climate. You mentioned the climate issue. That's like a gray rhino thing that's kind of unfolding in front of us. And then there's the artificial, especially not narrow intelligence, but general intelligence. If I look at the three-body problem, I'll present these as the three-body problem. And so and these are issues that actually require cooperation. What we are witnessing right now is basically the near demise of the neoliberal trading order. Luttwak's geoeconomics is back with a vengeance, or Blackwell's geoeconomics is back with a vengeance. So you've got trading blocks that are using coercive, tactics while cooperating within the blocks. So we're living in a strange world. So I want, before I close the program, without reference to nationalities, these simply as world problems. Christopher.
I think you're absolutely right. These problems will not be solved by a single nation state or even a coalition of like-minded nation states. Infectious disease, space. There are a number of areas that I think some in the United States and even the Biden administration imagine can be solved by like-minded states banding together and keeping out China and Russia and a handful of countries, in the autocratic area. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think it's practical. And so I think that we have to think more creatively about competing where it is necessary, but cooperating wherever possible.
Correct. Marc?
Well, what worries me most is that the very second that we need multilateral institutions to basically provide the kind of policy coordination and collaboration in order to tackle the global challenges that you presented, and that I believe have to be tackled urgently. This is the very second that these multilateral institutions are contested by great power competition. So we have to see how we go forward from here. I mean, I see, let's say, 4 grand scenarios how the world order is going to develop over the next 10, 20 years. There could be a Cold War. There could be a hot war between the US and China. There could be some sort of a concert of great powers, 19th century style, minilateralism, club governance, G20, whatever, something like that. Or there could be some sort of a grand bargain that adapts the American-led world order to basically the new weight of China and the other rising powers, what I call a Westphalian compromise. And here, I think it's up for Europe to really also put its weight behind a certain model, because Europe is a very special entity. It's a supranational, very fragile entity based on the rule of law that can only survive in a rule-based world order, right? So we need to make sure that we do everything that we can save and salvage whatever we can of the multilateralism that was developed, but it has to be adapted to the 21st century. This cannot be a multilateralism of 1945. And I think that is some real grand statesmanship that is being required. And frankly speaking, I'm a bit worried. I don't see much of this grand statesmanship around these days.
I'll join the club. I think at exactly the point that the world requires cooperation, there's going to be conflict. I think, and I am also a little skeptical, in fact, very skeptical, and sometimes critical also of the term rules-based order, because there is a clear sense of whose rules. I mean, post-Second World War, security architecture is essentially US-Europe dominated. And I think you got now other powers emerging, China being one, that wants to be part of the international order. Of course, it's a different kind of culture, it's a different kind of government. And therefore, the big question to me is whether we are going to actually do something pragmatic, or we are going to do the sort of neoliberal moralizing with reference to how countries should internally behave. It's an important question. And the easy answer is that, look, I've taken a moral position and I'm going to stick to that moral position. But then we have also seen that in realpolitik, the very countries that talk about this moral position have also reached out to countries that are dictatorial, totalitarian. So I think there's a bit of a, double speak there, which is fine. I, as a structural realist, I never get into the idealism of things. But finally, do you believe, because you talked about the concert, do you believe that the concert, we saw, again, hindsight is 2020, we saw how the concert and those alliances, instead of preventing war, actually pushed Europe into World War I. And so, Christopher, you and then Marc, before I close the program, I'm not much given to analogies because I think situations are different, but right. One can draw certain lessons from history.
Sure.
You think that, this kind of alliance making is going to actually prevent war, or is it going to contribute to one?
I think that is the question, and I think that I can map out a scenario whereby it creates a security dilemma that leads to war. I can map out other dilemmas where it is a deterrent effect and it contributes to reaching some kind of modus vivendi. But I think the key is in identifying sort of each major power's sort of critical national security interests and red lines. And that's a thing that I do not think that we here in the United States, or frankly in other parts of the world, have done a good enough job of acknowledging other states' interests as part of this discussion.
Marc Saxer?
Well, I mean, the parallels between the situation before World War I and now are obvious, right? We're seeing basically the decline of a global hegemon. Back then, it was the British Empire and the emergence of competitors. And as Thucydides said already 2,500 years ago, whenever that happens, the danger of war is in the air. And I think the danger of war is in the air today as well. Back then, there was not much institutionalization, these kind of backroom deals that were possible to keep at least the peace within Europe for the price of aggression outside of Europe. I'm aware of that. But within Europe, it was 100 years of relative stability. But it was not institutionalized enough to tackle these kind of challenges. And I do not believe a concert of great powers is enough to tackle the much more complex global challenges from pandemics to climate change that we're facing today. So I really think we should make a major effort to save the rules of the road, to save multilateral fora. I'm with you, Ejaz. It cannot be basically the rules that have been made in 1945. I think we have to adapt to the 21st century, but to keep some of the rules of the road, to keep some of the fora where we can come together and collaborate, I think is essential.
Absolutely. Anyway, on a lighter note, because there's been quite a lot of pessimism in the last section of this program, I'm so happy that you pronounced it as Thucydides. Because when I talk to my American friends, they pronounce it as Thucydides. So I tell them that you cannot pronounce it Clytemnestra. It is Clytemnestra. Greek does not have the C sound. So yes, it's Thucydides. And on that note, thank you so much, Christopher Preble. Thank you so much, Marc Saxer. I'm really grateful to both of you for your insights, for participating in the program. And hopefully we'll have other opportunities to discuss a number of points that have been flagged, but which we could not discuss, more in depth. So thank you so much. That's all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.